Hi Booktube, and welcome to today's video, which is a book review of this book, Outline by Rachel Cusk, which I've seen on Booktube getting a lot of praise heaped on it. But for me it's an absolute curate's egg of a book. It's rather sort of confused and confounded me. Just to say, my relationship with Rachel Cusk as an author, when I read her probably in the early 2000s, I read a couple of her books, and I found them, whether they were autobiographical or not, that's how they came over, which I always have a problem with, because I think writers should work harder to disguise their own source material, to make it have more chance of being universal and less subjective. But the other thing I found about her was she was curiously detached and remote in her tone. And, you know, she was sort of talking about deep emotions, but the tone in which she talked about it was completely divorced from the depth of emotion. So I sort of drifted away from reading her, and it was only because I'd seen this, which is part of a trilogy, sort of talked about in such sort of hushed, reverential tones. I thought, well, it's time to re-engage with her and see what we get. So the plot, such as it is an English woman writer goes over to Athens to teach a creative writing course for a limited period because she needs the money. That is the plot. What the book is a series of one-sided conversations with mainly strangers who project upon her their stories. So there are her students who she invites to tell their stories, and their stories are, because their students are inevitably autobiographical. But there's lots of people who aren't passing through her class. So, for example, the man she sits next to on the plane, complete stranger, tells her his story. She has a friend in Athens who's a writer, and she meets him for lunch, but the lunch is dominated by a friend that he invites along, who to the protagonist is a stranger. The woman teacher who's replacing her after her stint arrives at the flat that has been arranged for her to stay in, and so the protagonist is about to leave. Complete stranger. And all these characters feel impelled to talk to her about themselves, that she is almost, it's almost as though she doesn't exist, which I think is Cusk's intention. I think it's called The Outline because all the shapes about lives that these characters give by talking about themselves, if you bring them all together in a sort of tessellated mosaic, the negative space between the tiles of all these other stories forms the shape of the author, who very rarely, in her own words, gives us her own shape. But by how she's listening, what people feel they can project on her, the choices they make and what aspects of their life they're going to talk to her about, and her interpretations of what they say, that gives us little insights which build up into a story of the protagonist. I think why this book is talked about in reverential terms is because I think for most people it seems to be doing a very unusual and unique thing, which is to build up the character of its protagonist without letting her speak for herself, almost deliberately erasing herself, and yet we still are left with an impression of her, maybe a negative impression, like a brass rubbing or whatever. But to me that's not new and it's not unique. David Markson in his trilogy does that, and I think does it in a much more interesting way. So if people find it surprising what Cusk is doing here, I don't. And one of the other problems I have with it is that it sort of reads as if it's a series of creative writing sessions. There are only 2 sections of the 12 or whatever it is that are actually set in her class. So it's not that we're just treated to her create, as I say, these are sort of everyday conversations with strangers that she has outside of the class. But the way relationships are talked about, the way people talk about themselves, their failed marriages, their failed relationships, the great insights that they draw from this. Interestingly, the only ones who don't draw great insights are the students, because they are at the start of their sort of perceptive careers, starting to reflect on their material of their lives. They haven't quite got to the stage of being able to draw out sort of philosophical or elemental truths like all the other characters, who are pretty much all writers, which is one of the problems again I have with this book, that it seems that we are only privileged insight if we are of the writing, artistic, creative, self-reflecting classes, and that drives me to distraction. It is a book about creative people and writing, and I always find that problematical. But anyway, it's there is value in what Cusk, some of the revelations that Cusk has in this. It is about the difficulty of relationships. If you think about how sort of marriage and divorce is, just sort of exponentially, sort of exploded in contemporary life. People get together and marry or have relationships that are very ill-suited, even though they might not realise at the time, until it does all sort of implode. And Cusk offers, I think, some very, very valuable insights into this. So one of the things is that one possible way of conceptualising love or thinking about love is it's a mutually shared delusion or fantasy. And that for as long as the two partners are able to sort of maintain this, because it's shared, it's genuinely shared, even though it bears no resistance to reality, the relationship will carry on and will work. And if you think about when you first fall in love, you are sort of in a sort of fantastical space where you're everything else of life, such as feeding yourself and doing the laundry and all that, sort of falls away because you're in this sort of heightened plane of love. But Cusk is saying, well, no, in a way, the relationship has to sort of continue at that level to have any success. And I think that's a fascinating insight. And she says the problem for so many relationships, obviously, is that eventually one or both of the partners pulls away from that fantasy because they recognise it as fantasy. Or, other things that we well know of. You're in a relationship and one wants to change the other, into an ideal of what they want for their partner. So the man might have an ideal of the female that he wants to change his partner into, or the woman might have an ideal of the male that she wants to change her partner into, and that's destined for failure, of course. Partnerships where they're each the inverse of the other, they fill out the sort of vacated shape around the other one, so that it sort of slots together like yin and yang, and that's problematical. So there is valuable insight in here. I'm not saying that, but I just found it a very, as I say, to me the whole thing read like Cusk was offering us as if we, the reader, were attending a creative writing class. So there are all these sort of philosophical things thrown at us, but because the writer wasn't, because the protagonist wasn't saying these, they were sort of painted onto her or thrown onto her, varnished onto her by everyone in her life. It was as if they didn't have any sort of authority somehow. They were more like skits or bits to start sketches for writing. And I felt like I was being admitted into fragmentary wisdoms emerging out of a creative writing class, but one that was not going to lead me to be a writer. Not that, the book's not, I am a writer as it happens, but, a reader who's not a writer, why should they want to be conducted into, well, you're going to need these elements in order to be a good creator, crafter of character. That didn't sort of make any sense to me at all. Now, maybe I only read it that way because I am a writer and that's how I perceived it. So a non-writer reader might have no sense of that. I don't know. There were some other annoying things about this. Within the same page, Ryan, who is one of the fellow teachers, creative writing teachers on her course, comes from Ireland, comes from Tralee, but bases himself in Dublin. And he's telling his story to her. And he goes, well, me and my brother arrived in America at pretty much the same time. The brother was going to serve in the Marines. Now, I'm pretty sure, while non-American citizens can serve in the US Armed Forces, I think it's highly unlikely they would be admitted into the Marines. So that didn't ring true. And also, the way Cusk had written it, she said, as Ryan left Dublin, but she's written it as when he left the British Isles. Well, Dublin isn't part of the British Isles. The island of Ireland is not part of the British Isles. And I thought that was a sort of a basic mistake. And then there's another one where she's talking to Ryan later in the book. Again, don't forget that Ryan is a writer. And he'd gone out with his class and they were teaching him a few works of Greek. Quote, he hadn't realised how many English meanings came from Greek compounds. What kind of a writer of English doesn't appreciate the value to our language that ancient Greek has had? For instance, the word ellipsis, he'd been told, could literally be translated as to hide behind silence. It's fascinating stuff, he said. Well, to me that's ridiculous, because what kind of a writer doesn't know what the word ellipsis is? And if you know what the word ellipsis is as a writer, you're pretty likely to have sort of dug into what it is. I mean, to me that's just sort of, clumsy and done to hide behind silence, which is what the protagonist, it's a sort of crass way of, as my bookmark flies away, bookmarking something else for me to read out to you later. What kind of writer, doesn't know that? And the clumsiness of, well, this is to show another symbol to stand for the absent author. So not the absent author, the absent protagonist. That's the weird thing. The protagonist is absent, but the author seems to be teaching the class that the protagonist should be teaching, and the author is teaching the class to us, the reader. That's how it felt. So there were those sort of basic editorial problems that should have been spotted, I think. And mainly the protagonist doesn't say much, but when she does, she's sort of interpreting the material. So particularly the guy who sits next to her on the plane, he's telling her his life story. He's had 3 failed marriages and all of this, and she's sort of interpreting it, and she's sort of basically sort of saying, well, it's your fault. I, the protagonist, feel on the side of your wife, and the woman teacher who's coming to replace her at the end, she too got into conversation on the plane with her neighbour, who was a diplomat and could speak many, many languages. But one language that he had a problem with was Greek. He in his heart, he believed it was because he did not consider Greek itself to be useful. It was not an international language. Everyone in the diplomatic world had communicated in English. It would have been a waste in the end of his time. Well, that may be true, but he's gone to the trouble of learning, 8 other languages, which are not necessarily the languages of the world. But anyway, there was something so final, she said, in that remark that I realised our conversation was over. And it was true that even though the flight had another half an hour to go, we didn't say one more word to each other. I sat beside this man and felt the power of his silence. I felt almost as though I had been chastised. Yet all that had happened was that he had refused to take the blame for his own failure, and had rejected my attempt to read any kind of significance into it, a significance he saw that I was all too ready to articulate. Well, although that's not the protagonist making the interpretation of material, it seems like this woman, creative writer, has sort of stepped into, it's the next one off the conveyor belt of a woman who's struggling to sort of, determine her sort of outline. And makes the same thing of interpreting, a story a random stranger has taken to her, in the same way that on the original flight over, the protagonist also interpreted the material she was being fed. Yet all that had happened was that he had refused to take the blame for his own failure and had rejected my attempt to... So here, to me, this is a writer interpreting some material that someone is giving of their own life, and is casting judgment on it, as if she was casting over a character in her book. Does this read authentically? Is this? But that's the thing, that all these bits of sort of philosophical wisdom about life, love, relationships, men and women, they're not real. They can only exist. These interpretations, these sort of philosophical homilies almost, only exist in a world of fictional creation, not in actual life. So although the autobiographical style of these characters unloading their life stories, they are as stories, not as their life. And to be fair to Cusk, she makes the point about the difference between immersed in one's life, living it minute to minute, day to day, and the opposite of that, of always sort of being outside and trying to draw conclusions and trying to shape the material of one's own life to give it meaning. But so as much as I liked some of the philosophical insights of this, I felt they were being presented purely within a fictional canvas, and not that I'm a fan of realism, but they seem to be outside of realism. It's always with reference to characters talking and material being drawn from that to be presented in a fictional presentation, really. And that that devalued these insights to me. There's a point where she's in the water, swimming off a boat with the guys that she sat next to on the plane who had invited her to come onto the boat, and they see this family on another boat, and they seem to be sort of perfect, almost sort of like clockwork models on a music box that are moving around or whatever. And she's struck by the comparison with to her own life with Heathcliff in Wuthering Heights, where he's looking through a window and he sees his family inside. It represents everything that he hates and doesn't want to get into. Whereas for Cathy, looking at the window, that's what she desperately wants. And again, we come back to this idea of differing viewpoints, differing perspective, differing what the two people in a relationship want. And that's very well drawn in this is in From the Writing Class, where a woman is saying that she passed an open window of a music school that she used to be a student of, but had to give it up. And she heard the song, the music coming out of it, and she recognised it as Bach minor fugue or whatever. And it, someone else playing where she had formerly been meant that she revisited in its entirety her own sadness at her inability, for a number of reasons, to remain in the world. Certainly another person, she said, passing that window and hearing the D minor fugue, would have felt something completely different. In itself, the music coming out of the window means nothing at all, and whatever the feelings that might be attached to it, none of them had caused the music to be played in the first place, or the window to be left open so that the sound of it could be heard by passers-by. And even a person observing these events, she said, from across the road, could not have guessed simply by seeing and hearing what the story really was. What they would have seen was a girl walking past at the same time as hearing some music being played from inside a building. Which I think is a really interesting sort of deconstruction, where the woman telling this story, because she had a personal stake invested in it, and it represents something to her very, very subjective, that she had to give up her musical career. When she hears when she walks past the window, she hears the music, it brings up all these feelings. Whereas someone who has no investment in that, was not part of their life being in a music school, they would go past the window and hear the music and think nothing of it. And a third person who's observing a woman walking past the window and hearing the music, if they didn't know her story of having been an ex-music student, they would just see a woman walking past a window while music comes out of it, not a woman walking past a window brought into great sadness because of what that music represents to her. And also that sort of, because they're sort of using this material as the basis for their creative writing, the chance element of her walking past the window at that moment, that window being open so the music could be heard, all those sorts of random factors, that's not enough. That's why I say fiction, autobiographical fiction is not enough. You have to work the material, because it is a random set of factors. It is personal to her, but to someone who doesn't have that autobiographical experience of if they'd walk past that window, it wouldn't mean anything for them. So I find that, as interesting as it was, represents the limitations of what Cusk, I think, is trying to do here, of all these people telling stories, but only with a view to sort of a fictional version. It's two books I would mention that I have devoted fairly short Booktube videos, and I'll post the links to them here. One is Ida Hattemer-Higgins, The History of History, where she writes what is the difference between a knife being thrown at a door and sticking in the wood and sort of reverberating until the energy dissipates, and writing about that. Well, of course, the main difference is the time. a violent act of throwing a knife is, so quick, so fleeting. But if you write about it and you start sort of attaching metaphors to it, and you make a paragraph out of it, it's a completely different time scale. And the other one is Scarlett Thomas's Our Tragic Universe, where she rails against, making narratives of our own lives. And she looks at all, non-Western traditions of stories that are not these sort of, narratives with beginnings, middle and ends, and, chock full of meaning that we interpret and put in our lives. So I think, to me, they're much more valuable contributions to this, what is reality, what is fiction, what is narrative, than this book. And I'd recommend you go and read them. And then finally, this underlines, this relationship between fiction and narrative. So this is the second class that Cusk invites us to hear from the protagonist that she's teaching. And if I get the right place, it might help. And she's talking about one of the, the discipline she set for her students is write a story with an animal in it. And one of the students talks about how, and again, this comes over as pure autobiography, her story. So her kids had begged her for a dog, so she got them a dog, and it was a very naughty dog, and it kept stealing food and stuff. And in the end, one day she so loses her rag with the dog that she smacks it, and the kids are so shocked, and they, from that point on, they see their mother in a totally different way. And then one of the other students pipes in, "Once I too bought my son a dog," she said in a shocked and quavering voice, "when he was a little child. He loved it madly, and while it was still a puppy, it was run down before his eyes by a car in the street. He picked up its body and carried it back into the apartment, crying more wildly than I had ever known a person to cry. His character was completely ruined by that experience," she said. "He is now a cold and calculating man, concerned only with what he can get out of life." Well, I don't believe that for one moment. To me, that is, the equation of the event of a dog being knocked down, changing a child's character forever. That to me is fictional logic, not real life logic. And I don't believe it. In the same way as I don't believe that the children's view of their mother was entirely shaped by that one incident. That stuff happens in fiction, whether you buy it or not, depends on what has preceded it. But, it doesn't, I don't believe that represents real life. And that's where this book sort of, in exploring the relationship of realism and real life to fiction, I think it slipped through the cracks at that point. That sort of betrays it, to my mind. I think that's probably all I want to say on this book. There is a lot of worthwhile stuff. But to me, as I say, having read David Markson, which does it in a much more interesting and experimental and off-the-wall way, this thing about erasing the author in order to tell the story, in order to tell the story of the author, I think is much more successful than this. Because that part of it only seems to be one part of this. The other is about, the nature of storytelling, which Markson isn't really addressing as full on as Cusk is. But Cusk falls between the cracks, I think, in trying to do that of, what is the difference between autobiography, i.e. realism, and stories that people want to tell you, complete strangers, and fiction. There's one part in this. So I said that she went to lunch with a writer friend of hers, but the writer friend had invited a poet friend of his who dominated the conversation, who was a stranger to the protagonist. But the male writer says makes a sort of profound insight about human behaviour. And the poet says, "Would you mind saying that again?" And she writes it down. It's material. It becomes material for her to use, even though he's a writer and, he doesn't own that. He owns that anecdote, but he doesn't own the insight because, any human being can come to that insight. But she's going to sort of steal it off him, quite flagrantly, to use in her own work. And again, that's why I return to the thing, all the characters in here seem to think themselves uniquely privileged to offer insight into the human condition. because they're writers and creators, and yet the guides of the people that that they talk to, these strangers, is they're not necessarily writers and creators, but they have to be interpreted by writers and creators for them, for their stories to be given, to be verified and authenticated, and all of that, and I struggle with that. I really struggle with that. So I'm really bemused by this book. It wasn't as radical in it, it did have a strange effect, but I don't think in the way it was meant to. I didn't see it as nearly as radical as I think people seem to be saying for it. It still seems remote and detached as Cusk's earlier works. It deals with deep emotions, I'm not saying that, but so did those books. But she approaches it in such a sort of remote, distancing fashion. It is part of a trilogy. I will read the next one, because maybe I've got all this horribly wrong. Maybe it's me. Maybe I'm not seeing it. I would give this 3.5 stars, which in Goodreads I would round up to 4 rather than down to 3, because it's interesting in a challenging way. I mean, it makes you think. But for most, it seemed to make them think, oh my God, this is revelatory. Whereas to me, it made me think, no, that doesn't work. So there you have it. Rachel Cusk, the outline. I'd be interested to see what others say. I'm going to post a link to, I think, 2 more interesting takes on this subject, which is the Scarlett Thomas and the Ida Hattemer-Higgins. And I'll post the Markson as well. But the Markson book is not going to be for everyone, because it is quite sort of experimental and radical, and people might read it and go, what the hell is this? So I accept that. I mean, I have talked about it at length in my wrap up of postmodern works, so I'll post the link to that as well. So there you have it. Thanks very much. Till next time.